Florida Governor Ron DeSantis announces his bid for the White House, and will the United States default on its massive debt? Hello, I'm Sean Calebs filling in for Auden Naidu, and you're watching The Heat. Welcome, everyone. Negotiators reconvened Wednesday to continue their discussions on the U.S. debt ceiling. The nation is at a critical juncture as the $31.4 trillion debt limit inches ever so close to the deadline of June 1st set by the U.S. Treasury Secretary. The U.S. Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy, and the White House had this to say earlier.
The problem is the Democrats had been in power and they increased the amount of spending to the highest level we've ever had at any time in American history, especially to GDP. And now we have the highest debt at any time to American history. So I just think it's common sense, it's reasonable and it's rational that we spend less next year than we spend this year.
A default would have catastrophic impacts in every single part of this country, whether you're in a red state or in a blue state. It doesn't matter. Every single part of the country. We're talking about millions of jobs lost, devastated retirement accounts, and a recession. We've also heard some House Republicans refer to preventing default as the only concession they are willing to make. But preventing a catastrophic default is not a concession. It's their job, period.
Okay, meanwhile, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis has announced his run for the 2024 presidential election. DeSantis joins a number of other potential Republicans in the race for White House, but will he be able to secure his party's nomination for the presidency against Donald Trump? Well, to discuss this and a whole lot more, we're going to spend a few minutes first talking about DeSantis and where the election is, and then digging into the meat about the debt crisis. And joining us from Washington, D.C., is our good friend Joseph Williams, former senior editor for U.S. News and World Report. In Miami, John Quelch, the former dean of the University of Miami Herbert Business School. Out of New York, Robert Hockett is the Edward Cornell Professor of Law at Cornell University and former counsel at the International Monetary Fund. And we have Malik Abdul. He is a Republican strategist and host of Fault Lines on Sputnik News. Welcome, everybody. Thank you very much for taking time. We have a lot to get into. Malik, I want to start with you. Let's first talk about Ron DeSantis throwing his hat into the ring and announcing via Twitter he has really avoided trying to go through the mainstream media and really spent a lot of his time only doing interviews with more conservative members. Now, in announcing he joins Donald Trump, Nikki Haley, and perhaps a list of also-rans as well, do you think he has what it takes to become the next president of the United States?
Well, I must say that it was an interesting platform that the Ron DeSantis decided to launch. There were some problems early on, but it seems as if that the space is going now. I do hope that the glitch is not an omen for his campaign. Ron DeSantis is an interesting public figure. I've said all along, even going back to 2020, that I don't think that Ron DeSantis would be a formidable GOP nominee against any Democrat, particularly in this case, Joe Biden. Up against Donald Trump, he has a very hard time. We've seen over the months, even despite the fact that Donald Trump has had indictments and there have been other things happening with cases that he's involved in, Donald Trump's numbers have actually gone up. So the gap between Ron DeSantis and Donald Trump has gotten so far that it might be just impossible for Ron DeSantis to actually close that gap. But we'll see. I don't think that Ron DeSantis really has a chance in the primary, but, you know, it's a primary. Voters get to decide.
Okay. Joseph, DeSantis has been called the alternative to former U.S. President Donald Trump. And The Economist, I'm going to paraphrase a bit here, had this to say. DeSantis shares Mr. Trump's lack of humility, but not his lack of discipline and understanding of government, talking about him being a Harvard educator, serving in Iraq, 3 terms in Congress, and now being called the thinking Republicans populist. Give me your assessment of that statement, and if indeed he does square off against Donald Trump, how would he do against the presumptive Democratic candidate, Joe Biden?
I think that assessment is mostly correct. DeSantis, for all of you can say about him, he's not a foolish man. He's not a dumb man. He's got the credentials to prove it in the academic pedigree. He served a couple terms in Congress. He knows his way around Washington, and Florida has become kind of the exemplar, the test lab for a lot of Republican policies going forward towards 2024. The problem that he's got is, even though he's the thinking man's Trump, for lack of a better way to describe him. Not a lot of Republican primary voters want a thinking man's Trump. They want the real deal. They don't want a pale imitation, accept no substitutes. I think he's got a really good shot at making some noise, but I think part of the problem is that his appearance on Twitter tonight was kind of a metaphor. It wasn't necessarily an omen so much as a metaphor, as kind of a glitchy campaign that looked good and sounded good and was a good idea on paper, but when the rubber meets the road, it really kind of tends to fall apart. And keep in mind, we've also been here before. I mean, I'm thinking about Rick Perry, who was at one point hailed as the next shining light of Republican politics. Jeb Bush, coming strong early out of the gate in Florida, stumbles into the stretch because he ran into Donald Trump. Even Bobby Jindal, if we're going way back, thinking about him as a Republican shining light. We've got all these people that have great potential, southern state governors with a lot of governing, a lot of star power, and they just don't cut it against somebody like Donald Trump. So I think the case will probably be the same here. Plenty of time, anything can happen. A year is a lifetime in politics and no time at all. So I think it's up to Ron DeSantis to determine whether or not he can course correct, get some of these early flaws and mistakes out of the way, and make a strong challenge to Trump for the nomination.
John Quelch, you are in Florida, and you have seen DeSantis really control the narrative on what he says, how it gets out. He chooses who he talks to and how his statements are basically dissected by chiefly or always conservative media members. He's also faced a lot of criticism in recent months for his ongoing fight with Disney. Disney now pulling a multi-billion-dollar measure out of there. DeSantis' anti-abortion law and his new law enforcement relocation program that's spending something like $13.5 million to recruit new officers. And The Guardian reporting that a number of these officers have histories of, quote, excessive violence or have been arrested on crimes such as kidnapping and murder since signing up. How is this going to play once the rest of the nation begins to decipher all this?
So Governor DeSantis has done something really quite remarkable in Florida, which has turned a 50-50 state into a 19 percentage point victory margin in his recent re-election. He has stoked the economy of Florida. It's doing extremely well. It has the highest level of net inbound migration, the highest number of new business formations, and all of the items that you mentioned are debatable. They are part of his posture to challenge what he referred to on the Twitter call in the last 60 minutes, to challenge the woke mob, like it or not. And his position on these social issues, one might find debatable, but his point of view is that he's bringing common sense to issues in a way that others are not. And as far as Disney is concerned, I think that's probably a little bit of a mess up on his part, but by the same token, he wants to prove that he can be tough on corporate America as well, that he's a tough guy all round, not just selectively.
I think it's interesting. I think a lot of people are going to wonder if Disney's really where you want to pick your major fight right now, considering what it means to the state of Florida. But we're going to switch gears. Robert Hockett, I'm going to spare you talking about Ron DeSantis. I want to talk about the debt ceiling, where we are, how critical this is as we kind of meander toward this deadline, depending on who you listen to. Let's hear what U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen had to say. She is the one who says there's a June 1st deadline where this must get done, or the U.S. really runs the risk of not having enough money to pay its debts.
I think the most important thing to recognize is that we must raise the debt ceiling. There isn't any outcome that is acceptable. We will default on some obligation, and that's really not an acceptable state of affairs. It threatens the strong recovery that we have in the U.S. economy. It threatens financial markets, and we simply have to raise the debt ceiling.
Okay, now for those who don't know what a debt ceiling is, why it is so important, and why obviously there is so much attention focused on it right now. Can you break it down for us?
Yeah, sure. So the debt ceiling purports to be a law limiting the amount of money that the United States can borrow. The United States typically is legislated, there's a sort of legislative mandate for the United States to borrow because Congress and the president together always formulate a very detailed budget that, among other things, prescribes a certain amount of revenue in the form of taxation, then a certain amount of expenditure, and then, of course, a certain amount of debt issuance to cover any gap between revenue and expenditure. It's important to note that the debt that we're talking about right now is already owed, essentially because, or precisely in fact because, it was legislated into law last year, last autumn, in last autumn's budget. So what we're really talking about right now is a sort of vestigial provision in the U.S. Code, the debt ceiling, which is in effect sort of smack dab against or contrary to another law in the U.S. Code, namely last year's budget. So what we have here is a classic conflict of laws. There are two ways to deal with something like that, right? One is to remove the conflict by just raising the ceiling. The other is, of course, to litigate in court and to find one of the laws essentially invalid. The Biden administration has 7 good legal arguments to essentially find or argue in favor of finding the debt ceiling insofar as if it were applied, it would cause a default to the court to find it invalid. But the administration is trying to avoid that, of course, because the uncertainty that they think would attend litigation in the courts would itself roil the markets. So they're hoping to find some kind of a deal. And insofar as, or for as long as it looks as though some palatable deal might be had, I think that's the greater likelihood. But Mr. McCarthy, of course, is boxed in by 6 Republicans who can oust him, right, from the speakership if they decide to. And they are also the ones who are insisting on being as draconian as possible. So if those guys box McCarthy in too much, and then McCarthy has to box Biden in too much, then we will see the litigation.
Malik, also, and picking up on what Robert said about House Speaker, it's arguable, if you listen to what people said when he was elevated to that position, that he basically made a deal with the devil, that he could be removed very easily. And he has spoken at length about the negotiations going on and saying that the United States will not default. He keeps saying spending is the problem, not revenue. Now, Biden has given 3 compromises: freeze spending by more than $1 trillion over the next decade, rescind unspent COVID funds, meaning money's not going to be spent working on new virus inoculations moving forward, and putting a 2-year cap on spending. Not enough for Republicans. Why not?
Well, I actually haven't heard Kevin McCarthy comment on those specifically. There were a number of other things in the bill that the Biden administration were looking for, and it's revolving around taxes. That's typically where it is. So when you hear things like revenue increases, what that means, at least from Kevin McCarthy's perspective, that you're talking about raising
that's
taxes.
fair. But also, let's be fair about this as well, that the president has said he will try to freeze spending, rescind that COVID money. Let's focus on that first, and then we'll talk about the taxes.
Well, that's what I said. I haven't heard Kevin McCarthy reject those 2 deals that you're referencing as far as the cap on spending or even potential increases or spending cuts down the road. What I have heard him talk about, at least as far as what he's articulated, the things that Republicans are pushing back against is this idea of workplace requirement, the things that we were just talking about with revenue. So that's an important part of the Republican Party's opposition to this. I would suspect, and there's a lot of conversation about how Republicans are doing this, and this isn't unprecedented. Back in 2019, we were in the same place, and in fact, in 2019, they didn't strike a deal on the debt ceiling until July. So we're much earlier than where we were in the Trump administration when Nancy Pelosi and Democrats decided to push back on what the Trump administration were and they did eventually agree to a deal that capped spending. And at some point, they were spending, I think maybe over a 10-year period or something. I imagine that's
Right.
what we're going to see out of this bill. Neither side will get everything that it wants. And I
Sure.
think that whether it's debate or those of us in the middle, we need.
Okay, Joseph, let's move on to you. I want to get your feelings on what Malik just said firstly. And also, I read just before I came out here, Marjorie Taylor Greene saying that there's a certain faction within the House Republicans that don't want to compromise. They want to move forward on a measure they approved back in April. And also a quote that she had that said, Americans aren't worried about the debt ceiling. The only people worried about the debt ceiling are at the New York Stock Exchange. I mean, to me, one could argue that that's a shocking admission of how little one can really grasp on how important this is moving forward.
And that, I think, is the problem. I mean, that's the nut of the whole discussion here. And I think that in this particular program, we've been here before, it's probably going to be the through line between talking about Ron DeSantis and coming out of Florida not doing so hot, and the debt ceiling. We've been here before. And part of the issue is that this is an artificial construct. I mean, the whole notion of the debt ceiling is a little bit more complicated for people to grasp. I mean, Robert broke it down quite nicely, but it's difficult for ordinary people, run-of-the-mill people grabbing a newspaper or whatever to grasp, and certain members of Congress can't seem to understand exactly what the debt ceiling is about. And this is a manufactured crisis in that the Republicans have decided to hold the debt ceiling hostage. Now, you can argue that the Democrats miscalculated in considering that McCarthy didn't have the organization and the votes to make this maneuver, but he does, and he did, and this is where we are. So part of the issue has to be whether or not we can get rid of this once and for all after this deal, and whether or not a deal, quote unquote, can be struck. I mean, a deal more like, giving the hostages what they want so they'll let the debt ceiling increase, can actually go forward that won't hurt people's 401k retirement plans, and that won't punish the poor by issuing work requirements, forcing them to do something that research has shown time and again really doesn't work. We had work requirements under Clinton. We had it under several other presidents. It does not make people go from welfare to work any more quickly. And besides, that opens up a whole other discussion talking about healthcare and whether or not there's going to be people that can afford to pay someone to take care of their children while they're at work. So it's all a morass. It's all kind of artificial. We should have seen this coming, and I'm surprised that the Democrats didn't try to head this off at the pass when they had the opportunity. But certainly going forward, we do have to do something about this, and we have to make sure that this doesn't happen again.
That's a good point. The Democrats are getting blistered for not having the foresight to take care of this earlier through legislation. I want to play you, Joseph, if you will, what House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries had to say about the stalemate. Listen.
They've taken revenues off the table. They don't want to revisit the GOP tax scam. It's exploded the debt by $2 trillion to subsidize the wealthy, the well-off, and the well-connected. They said, no, we can't have a conversation about that. Can't have a conversation about revenue. Can't have a conversation about any policy changes that Democrats would like to have. Does that sound like a negotiation? Or is that a hostage-taking situation? It's a hostage-taking situation, and the hostage is the economy and the American people. And it's time to move in a different direction.
Joseph, is he right?
Grudgingly, I would say that he's got a couple of points, and not the least of which is the fact that this was something that could have been avoided. This was something that the Republicans decided to do when they had the opportunity to talk about spending cuts and to make plain where they're coming from. Certainly, Kevin McCarthy needs to do something like this. It was among the conditions for him to become Speaker. So it is kind of hard to dispute exactly what Representative Jeffries is saying, especially since there have been so many talks about, well, we will not do this, we will not do that, and theoretically, both sides have issued demands saying things that they will not do. The Republicans have been much more adamant about this, it seems to me, than the Democrats, but it still is something akin to meet our demands or we'll let the economy fall off a cliff. Realistically, I hope and I think and I pray that that won't let that happen, but it's hard to see how McCarthy will have the gumption to not do something forceful with the likes of Marjorie Taylor Greene, Matt Gaetz, and the Freedom Caucus crowd behind him, egging him on to take on this once and for all and to bring Democrats to heel.
You know, John, there's been a great deal of reporting on this issue, and I think some really fascinating and insightful comments out there. According to the Wall Street Journal, the Democrats will not consider rolling back spending on non-military programs, then capping annual increases, as well as applying work requirements for those receiving federal benefits we talked about. Republicans have dismissed tax increases, a method the Democrats would prefer to use in a way to narrow the deficit. Give me your insight on where we stand, what both sides are looking at, and what you think about what you've heard so far here tonight.
We are coming down to the wire as far as June 1 is concerned. If nothing is organized by Friday, it's going to be extremely difficult to have passage through the House prior to the June 1st deadline. Just one point on the Republican side. I mean, the Republicans did at least take the initiative and pass the bill through the House in April. And the president's counter bill has not been voted on. So in a sense, the Republicans are in the driver's seat. I do agree with Mr. Williams that the Democrats have been slow off the mark in terms of misunderstanding and perhaps underestimating Speaker McCarthy's relative strength and or determination here. What are the scenarios going forward? They could reach a deal and avert disaster before June 1. A second scenario is that they could vote to increase the debt ceiling temporarily enough to cover the time period through to September the 30th, which is the end of the fiscal year. I think the Republicans feel as though they have the bull by the horns at this stage and are probably going to be reluctant to do that. So the scenarios are not pretty, but there has to be surely a common determination to avoid a cataclysmic meltdown of the economy. And I want to point out also, Sean, that, you know, compared to 2011, 12 years later, the dollar's relative strength and standing and reputation globally is not what it was 12 years ago.
That's a good point.
And a lot of our competitors internationally are looking to see whether or not they can get an edge out of the U.S. Congress and the president combined not being able to do what has to be done.
Yeah, I think, John, interesting what you say. Internationally, this is not a good look for the United States. Let's take a step back. And who is the public going to blame, both from the residents here in the United States and the people throughout the world? Will they blame the Republicans, or will they blame the Biden administration?
I think we've actually only got two possibilities before us, right? I don't believe that the 6 Republicans who hold McCarthy's fate in their hands are actually going to give him the space to enable Biden to agree to a deal. In other words, they won't agree, I don't think, with any compromises that Mr. McCarthy would otherwise be willing to make that would be prerequisites, I think, to make a deal possible for Mr. Biden. That in turn means I think we have only two possibilities before us. One is that Mr. McCarthy goes ahead and makes a deal with Mr. Biden anyway, with a side deal for enough Democrats in the House to support him to stay as the Speaker even after he loses those 5 or 6 radical Republicans. Or in the alternative, if Mr. McCarthy doesn't want to take that gambit, then I think he forces Mr. Biden's hand, and we see this go to the courts. And as I suggested before, there are 7 legal reasons
right.
The debt ceiling is no longer good law. So they will lose, the Republicans would lose in court. But what the Biden administration is worried about is that the markets would be roiled until that resolution were to be found in the court. And that's why I think he's trying to avoid litigation. But if he's pushed against the wall, he'll litigate. Or what I mean is he'll ignore the debt ceiling and force the Republicans to litigate. That will be very bad optics for them, because they would effectively then be asking the court to require Mr. Biden to breach scores of millions of contracts, to require Mr. Biden to violate the federal budget law that was passed last before last October, to force Mr. Biden to default on U.S. Treasuries, which we've never defaulted on before, and to force Mr. Biden essentially to take more power to himself than the Constitution actually permits, because he would have to violate the take care clause and or the presentment clause that prevents line item vetoes in order to prioritize payments. So, I don't think the Republicans have much of a case if this goes to court, but Biden, again, would prefer, I think, to avoid that.
I like the emergency siren going off in the background. It is kind of typical of what the U.S. is facing right now. But let's talk about the consequences, because really no nook and cranny throughout the world would not be affected. I mean, everybody would be affected by this if the U.S. does default. I want you to listen to what Garrett Epps, a professor of law at the University of Oregon, had to say about the possible consequences should the U.S. default.
The results of this would be catastrophic economically. You'd immediately, the estimates have been that the gross national product might contract over the following 12 months as much as 6 or 7%, that millions of jobs would be lost. And the international monetary system would enter crisis, because the dollar and the repayment of dollar-denominated bonds, is the reserve currency for the world. So that even a short default would have permanent negative effects.
Okay, Robert, permanent negative effects. What does he mean there?
Well, I mean, there are multiple permanent negative effects here, right? First of all, of course, the U.S. dollar and dollar-denominated assets, as Garrett said, are the reserve asset par excellence in the world, right? Not only all American 401ks and retirement funds, but all retirement funds worldwide, pretty much all securities portfolios worldwide, are very much padded with U.S. Treasury securities, precisely because they are the archetypal safe asset, the safest of safe assets. There's literally nothing that can compete with that, right? Now, the Chinese currency and Chinese sovereign debt, in theory, could compete with that, but China does not have open capital markets. It does not allow its sovereign debt to be traded on world markets. Meanwhile, the European Union is not stable enough for its particular bonds ever to have become competitive with treasuries. Japan would be the next option, but again, it simply doesn't issue nearly enough. We've got close to $25 trillion in U.S. treasuries outstanding worldwide. That would essentially be the end of the global capital markets. And it's worth noting that what this also means is suddenly American borrowing costs would shoot through the roof. And that would mean not just sovereign borrowing costs, but individual borrowing costs, right? All of us would have to pay an awful lot more to borrow, because U.S. Treasury securities are used to benchmark all other interest rates. Furthermore, U.S. Treasury securities are the so-called risk-free asset that is used in all of the pricing models used by all of the trading houses on Wall Street and worldwide. And so those pricing models would be out the window in this case. And so you would see trading come to a halt. You'd see interest rates shoot up in the U.S. Mortgage rates would go up high. Basically, at least 33% of Americans underwater on their mortgages again, because their housing values would drop.
All very good points. Robert, we're going to have to leave it there. That half an hour went very fast. I want to thank all of our guests. Great insight. I really enjoyed the discussion. And as I said, we're going to leave it there. I'm Sean Calebs in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching another edition of The Heat right here on CGTN.